this February 1st working session of the DC State Board of Education to order. I would like to add 2 items to the agenda under suspension of the rules. I would like to ask for unanimous consent to add a discussion of new physical education standards and related materials and a discussion and materials related to the draft ESSA accountability plan. Are there any objections? Seeing none, they are added.
So, Madam President, since Donna is still on her way, I think we might be able to do a quick discussion on the mission statement. So I have files if anyone didn't grab a chance to read them online. As members know, there's a new proposal for our new mission statement. In December and again in January. Did anyone have any further revisions to the mission statement before it's added to the February 15th public meeting?
Oh, when we get it, you're right.
It's in there.
Oh, yeah.
It's the second page. Great. Okay. Same thing. So the next page, next 2 pages, related to the censure procedure. As members will remember, Ruth had some concerns about the length of the censure procedure in the bylaws, and so I've tried to revise them down. Didn't know if anyone had any additional questions. Ruth, did you have?
Yeah, I mean, my concern wasn't explicitly the length, although I thought the length was a problem. My concern was that it was this enormous thing that seemed to be plopped into the middle of the bylaws that allowed us to investigate our colleagues and reprimand them and censure them, and it seemed like I wasn't quite sure the reasoning for such a big thing. It seems like, I guess I just didn't get it, and I think you were gonna check with NASB and see what was common across other state boards of ed. It just seemed odd and extreme. That was really mine.
If I might jump in really quickly on the genesis of just this whole section, which was very different previously, was when I was on my ANC, we added a provision about regarding censure and removal of officers, including committee chairman or leadership, to give as just a good government measure. So I brought that to the board, and the previous board agreed and added that to the bylaws. I think what John Paul, as I see it, and I'll let him confirm this, is certainly it's good governance to be able to remove members from leadership. We can't remove each other from the board, but we could from leadership. But there should also be a mechanism to protect members if an allegation is brought against them. And I think that's sort of the balance that we're trying to achieve here. Is that correct?
Yes. So the bylaws in their old state just simply said that the state board has the ability to censure members, but didn't give a process, didn't give any kind of idea of exactly what that would mean. And so I went to the council, the DC Council's rules, and took most of this text directly from their rules, because I know that has been vetted by not only DC lawyers, but Vega and others that specifically deal with DC related ethics. And then I went back again and took out some of the sort of extraneous things that I thought were sort of overly processed and put them back in. I did speak with a colleague at NASB who did some basic research on these types of things in other state boards or other state education agencies. It would be unusual to have this length, but he said it is common in government agencies to have, for elected memberships like ours, to have some sort of procedure in place, and whether that's in a policy or bylaw, it's sort of up to us. But there are examples of state boards that have a large procedure in place. So if we want to remove this process and put it as a policy, we can do that, or we can leave it here as part of the bylaws. He said either way is not fully uncommon, but it isn't. There are examples of both styles in other state boards of education and other elected bodies nationwide.
Well, I'm curious what other people think. I mean, I think the fact that other state boards don't have it is telling. I think it's great that you checked with the council, but we're so different. I mean, one of the things is we don't have time to get to come to our committee meetings on things that we're responsible for. I mean, this calls for creating investigatory committees, and any 3 members of the board can do it. It seems to me, I get the good government piece. It also seems to me that there's a lot in here that can be used for like faction fights and stuff. And I don't know. It seems out of place. And I guess I continue to think that, having looked at it. I wonder if there's a more simple way, sort of as we do with our HR, to say if there's an issue and it can't be dealt with sort of internally through conversations, is there a vega that we can go to, as opposed to sort of bringing it inside and sort of having it kind of take over sort of our internal structure. I mean, I think the idea here is we're not expecting it, and it's not likely to happen. But if something did, what is this for, and how could we deal with it in the most efficient and fair way? So, do you have any comments?
I have a question. So, when was this language put in?
January.
So, this language regarding censure and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so, well, there in the previous bylaws, there was 2 sentences, I think, that just allowed the state board to censure its members for infractions.
Specific infractions.
Specific infractions.
And in fact, it had to be breaking a law or misappropriation of funds, basically.
And has there ever been like a resolution of censure against a board member?
Not to my knowledge.
So there's, at this point, like, as a board, we have no clue how this would actually be implemented if it were to happen.
Correct.
Right, I was just curious.
Very careful.
Why did we broaden it from the specific infractions? I guess that's part of it. It feels very global.
In an effort to bring some process. I mean, it was just a matter of,
So
when we were reviewing the bylaws, it was one of the things that.
And if a charge is brought against me as a member to remove me as vice president or as a committee chair, I want to have a process. I think I deserve to have a process in place to defend myself. And I think that's what this provides, a process for the accused.
But it's not just for officers, it's for anybody. I'm reading it.
Anyone could be censured, yes.
Yeah, so it's not just the removing officers. That's what it
But that's the only power we have, other than we can issue censure and we can remove people from leadership positions, but we can't like remove you as a board member.
Right. But so it could be applied to anybody at the level of the censure. I mean, I guess for violation, the evidence of violation of DC Code of Conduct, which seems for DC people, that makes sense. Or DC law, that makes sense. I don't know what policy, it seems so broad. And
What's your worry with this?
it's that it goes overboard in creating a process that's not needed, and that potentially can be very unhealthy and dangerous. I mean, I guess that's, having been in organizations, where you have small groups of people who want to hurt things, you can have 3 people greatly upset the operation of an organization. It seems to me an unhealthy way to set it up. That's why it seems odd and misplaced and overbroad. That's why.
And I make a suggestion that we finish the discussion later.
I agree.
And we also revisit the mission statement.
Tom? Hi. We're up for physical education. Says, let me make sure that you're actually in the frame.
No.
Very good.
Thank you so much for having me back tonight. Again, I'm Donna Anthony. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Health and Wellness. And tonight I came with Katie from my team to talk a little bit about the physical education standards. We had sent a copy to the state board, largely adapted from the SHAPE national standard, and had noted where we wanted to make some minor tweaks just to make sure that they were relevant, both timely and to to students who live in the district. And so wanted to just kind of open it up to talk to folks if they had any questions. I'm happy to talk a little bit. I know Laura had asked previously to talk about our strategies. One thing I will say is it's kind of it's a three-step strategy, which is ensuring that students have access to PE, ensuring that students have access to enough PE, and ensuring that they have access to quality PE. And we're working on both the access and the quantity through the Healthy Schools Act amendment process, and we're working on that actively right now. And then the quality piece really comes into play here with the standards themselves. So that's how this kind of fits into the broader picture around our approach related to physical education.
Any discussion?
Great. See you on February 15th.
Right, thank you so much for having me. This was my best meeting today.
Thank you.
Well, I guess, one question, we talked last time about public engagement, and I understand that there's been, something posted on our website related to the standards. Could you just describe what the process will be for public engagement? I know you already talked about the committees that you had to get to this stage, but just going forward since they're new standards.
Absolutely. So we'd like to post a copy on our website as well and solicit any feedback that folks want to give either through the board or through OSSI directly. And then we're also continuing the discussion with our committee, and the committee is focused on all three of those measures. So how will we support the implementation, because they've already kind of moved past what the standards look like themselves and are thinking about how do we create that successful implementation throughout the district for next school year. And so those two ways are really how we're engaging at this point, just because everyone really seems on board with it, and we're kind of ready to go and excited to get moving on it.
Laura, and I think one of the other things that I've understood from Donna and the team is just that many phys ed teachers in the district are already looking to these as the national standards, which is part of why, if they were new and different and dramatically not familiar, I think we would feel like much more engagement was needed directly at the teacher level. Given that we've heard that so many phys ed teachers are already looking to these, adopting them as our DC standards sort of seems like more of a common sense measure than really different than.
Absolutely. This is what they're trained on typically in school, and what a lot of the curricula is developed around related to physical education. And so the Centers for Disease Control had created two tools, one for health education and one for physical education to vet curricula. It's based on those national standards. And so it makes ready-made tools that allow them to choose kind of what they want to be teaching related to these standards in their classroom. So it opens up a world of ready-made things that are available to them that they are probably already using, but just making sure that there's that equity across the district and knowing that everyone's kind of aligning up to that national level, that standard that we have set.
And do you feel that it's necessary to engage a broader public like parents?
My understanding is that parents are really concerned about access and quantity over the quality itself, and so we've been focusing on engaging some parents through the Healthy Schools Act forum related to those questions. But anyone will be able to provide us feedback when we post them on the SE website, parents, teachers, students, community members.
If they know they're there, right? I'm just wondering how we as a board feel about that compared to the health standards and the over 2-year process and all of the engagement. We had multiple hearings. And
That was an overly cumbersome process, and it was necessitated by the fact that we didn't have a state superintendent who was willing to work with us on that at the beginning. So we had to initiate that whole process on our own and do all of the work and research on our own and work with groups. This is a very different process that we have now with the superintendent's office, and we've worked very closely with both the superintendent and her team to make sure that we're doing this in a better manner. When new national standards come out, we're working together to look at them and to make sure that they're tailored to meet the needs of our population, not necessarily the national population. I think that OSSI is making a good effort to do that here. Certainly, if board members think that the process can be improved and more outreach needs to be done, I would love to work with the board members or with OSSI to achieve that goal.
Just two other thoughts there too, Jack. So one for the new members, the era that Jack is referring
said previous.
And then, just on the, I think one other distinction I see between the health standards and the physical education standards is the health standards have so much content that is very sensitive, right? And that I think it made sense to have much more extensive vetting. When we think about the PE standards, they're just not, they just don't, the content to me does not feel quite as sensitive to it. So
And the only other piece that I would add is that the national health standards are actually quite outdated. They're about 10 years old, and so we've moved without new national standards because our students needed the supports.
Question also on engagement. So can you, and you may have done this last night, can you just review, I mean, who this went out to? I mean, so to what extent have the PE teachers and or say the principals in the schools in each of our wards seen this? I mean, largely, partly, somewhere in between?
Right, so our work has mostly been through our Health Youth in Schools Commission, which has representation from school leadership, both central office and student and parent. And we have a subcommittee that is open to the community, so it's not just the commission members, and that has been such a variety of different people. I'm looking at Katie because she's been running our subcommittee. It's had a lot of community-based organizations who are providing these services in the school, so they have that day-to-day insight of what's happening and what's not happening. It has people from central office from charter schools, as well as the charter school board, as well as DCPS central office, who oversee all of the physical and health educators in the system. So more of the higher level, but we have had some sprinkling of people that are more on the ground as well. And those meetings happen monthly, and we've been pretty consistent about having them and having a really good turnout and conversation. And so those will continue because, again, we still have to address implementation, access, and quantity. So that's not something that we see ever stopping. There's always going to be more work to do.
Do you think that if I were to sort of mention this to an average PE teacher in school, that they would have some idea that this was happening and know that they had had an opportunity to take a look?
I can't say that 100% of PE teachers are going to say yes. I think we can post these and make sure that we're getting it out on the LEA Look Forward. We're also getting it out to all of our school leaders in the email that DCPS sends out daily to their educators, as well as on the public charter school board side as well, to make sure that we're doing that large push to make sure everyone's on board and can hear any feedback that people may have.
Then do you reach out to the school level so that we're just insofar as it's DCPS, does it have to go to the DCPS down to the school, or can you send out to schools and do that?
So we do it for a variety of ways. We do it both through DCPS and the Public Charter School Board, just because those are existing communication vehicles people are paying attention to, and that gets to the school leader level. We also have our LEA Look Forward that goes out weekly, and that is thousands and thousands of subscribers. That's parents, community-based organizations, teachers, and so that's getting to all the different levels, but not necessarily every single school per se. The other thing is we're talking with this, we have health points of contact in a lot of our schools where we talk about the health assessment, the health standards, the BE standards, Healthy Schools Act, and so making sure that we communicate through.
So that's at the school level. That's at the school level. That's really what I'm concerned about, that this hasn't all just been held up at a district level, but that if you walk into the school, people in the school know that something has been discussed.
Absolutely. My sense is that people want to move in this direction and would feel refreshed so that they're not dealing with competing what they've been trained on, what a lot of things follow nationally versus what they're mandated to do in a district. This is creating more of a seamless system that allows them to focus on lesson planning and implementation.
John Paul, could I just suggest that we send out a press release just about this?
Sure.
Because the last one didn't link to the actual standards themselves, it linked to the national with the red line that we created. Just to make sure, I'm just worried that this is going through very fast at a policy level, and we're saying like, yeah, lots of people have been on board. It's like if I lose an election, I'm like, I don't get it. Everyone I knew voted for me, right? There's a little bit of that.
Totally.
You know what I mean? And so I want to make sure that we have done due diligence there as a board.
Yeah, and we'd appreciate you helping us get the word out.
I would add, if you can also send us a link, then we can just include it in our regular newsletter.
Sure.
Okay. Like a link that says exactly where we are in the process, what people do to comment on it, and everything.
Great. We can work on that.
All right. Last time you said no more questions.
Still easiest meeting
All
of the
right,
day. Thank you
okay.
so much.
All right, we'll move on to, Ethel. Every student succeeds at?
Great, thanks everyone for, continuing the conversation with us, and we know there was, we appreciate the chance to come back and talk. So obviously, I think you all know that we posted our draft state plan on Monday evening, a little bit later than we were hoping to, but on Monday, and it is a lengthy document. The template that Ed requires us to complete has lots of questions in it, and so it's about 120 pages of text. So in addition to the actual draft state plan, which I missed out on.
Yeah, I have copies for all the members if you want.
Okay. Knowing that 120 pages is a lot to digest and the question structure and so on aren't always intuitive, one of the things we posted alongside the draft state plan was this letter from me that we've just passed out that walks through some of the high-level themes in the state plan. So you can see the first page is just some context around what ESSA is and why it matters, and then there's a few sections of additional content. So the first section is just, again, advertising the upcoming community engagement opportunities that with the meetings that we're hosting with you all. The second section walks through some of the themes in our accountability plan and tries to pull those out and explain them in plainer language, hopefully. And then the third section talks about is a guide to the other sections of the state plan, the non-accountability section. So just briefly on the accountability sections and the principles starting on the third page here. We will talk in more detail about some of these, but some of the key features that we pulled out are the fact that there's an overall rating for each school that ranges from 1 star to 5 stars, so it has 5 different categories that will be issued on an annual basis, and that it's based primarily on the overall performance of all students, but also looks at the performance of specific groups of students.
Are you saying this is sort of an outline of what you're going to do with the meetings? Is that what you were saying?
No, sorry, I'm just
you're saying, okay.
walking you all through this.
Keep going, sorry.
The second principle is the balanced view of academic progress and achievement, which we've talked a lot about and are going to discuss further today. The third is the importance of school environment, and just walking through some of the measures we included on that. The fourth is some of the additional indicators that broaden the view of school performance, and then the fifth is just explaining why we focused on currently available and established measures for now. And so we just wanted to highlight this to make sure you all knew that this existed. It's posted on our same page as the overall state plan, osce.dc.gov/ESSA. And so if you have folks who are want to engage at a slightly deeper level, but are not ready to wade through 120 pages, I would just point this out as one document that could be helpful. And most of this content is also replicated within the 120 pages. There's an executive summary at the beginning that is primarily the same content that's here in this order. So wanted to just point that out as a summary that's a little bit shorter and more accessible for folks. And then briefly on the guide to the overall state plan, which is on these last 2 pages here. Again, we talked about this at the last public meeting briefly, but there are a number of these other required sections. So one section is around long-term goals and where we want to go. And I just want to be candid here that this was a challenge for us in some ways to draft, because there's this tension between what we want to be true for all students and what we believe that any individual student is capable of, that we believe firmly, with the realities of our current system, right? So we know that right now there's a huge gap between outcomes between our African American and our white students. Our students in special education are performing incredibly low currently, and we're required to set these long-term goals, not only for all students, but for each individual subgroup of students. And so for white students to continue to see progress, you have to set the goal above 79%, where they are right now. And yet, to set that same goal overnight for our African American students would unfortunately just not match the reality, would not be feasible. And I think one of the things we saw under No Child Left Behind is just the danger of having goals that feel out of reach, and that then don't feel inspiring for educators or for schools. And so we have tried to strike that balance by laying out ultimately a 20-year trajectory that gets to having the same achievement for all students at the end of that time, but working urgently over the next 10 years to cut gaps in half. And to work, like I said, absolutely urgently towards that point, and being clear that all along the way, this is not about our beliefs about any individual student, but we believe that every child can achieve at really high levels, and it's just in the aggregate goals that we're trying to strike a balance. The next section is around consultation and performance management. After that, there's a section around academic assessments, in which we're not making major changes in DC. We're continuing with the same assessments we've had. A section around supporting excellent educators, how we make sure every child is a great teacher and great leader. And then finally, around supporting all students. And there are some questions around specific groups of students, like students who are in foster care or neglected and delinquent youth, or students experiencing homelessness. For some of those specific sections. So that is it in terms of a guide to our overall plan. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my team who's going to talk through a couple of the items that we wanted to follow up with you all on, and then we can open it up for open discussion at that point.
Great. So Huntsville touched on this briefly as it was in the open letter to the community, and I know it was in a deck that we didn't have a chance to go through in a ton of detail at our meeting that was on the 13th. So I just wanted to review that our system proposes to have annual star ratings that are on 5 levels. So again, 1 being lowest, 5 being the highest, and then this would happen annually. And that it would be provided to all schools in DC, so to District of Columbia Public Schools as well as to public charter schools. And on the right, you'll just see an example of a kind of public reporting we currently have available. Over the course of the next year, we'll be developing school report cards using additional input from the community and from lots of other folks that will include the star rating along with other information that may be relevant to parents and families.
And I know we've talked about this a lot, that there may be certain indicators that may not make sense to include in the formal accountability system for points, but that we could include on the school report card to have transparent information.
And again, those report cards will come out for the first time by the end of the calendar year 2018. So that's why there's some issues. So what we wanted to spend some time today talking through are some scenarios of how the current proposed system allows certain schools to fare. And so we've heard from you a sort of desire to understand, well, what happens if a school does this well in a certain category and this well in another category? You know, is the system fair, and can you help us to better understand that? So we think these scenarios will help to play out some of what we're seeing in the preliminary data. I should, caveat all this by saying that what we're sharing is exactly that. This is scenarios run based on what's in our current draft state plan. It's based on only having one cycle of data, meaning we have data from 15-16, and for some measures that look back to 14-15, we don't have the pleasure of looking back over 3 years and saying, like, was it stable, was it not? And so this is based on the data we currently have.
And for that reason, you're going to see that on some of the numbers that we present, that we generalize them. Because this is so preliminary, we didn't want to reveal individual school information. But we did want to provide some detail to give you all a sense of how actual schools are playing out in our preliminary analysis.
So one of the scenarios that we've heard a lot of interest in is what happens in a situation where there is a school that is being very successful in terms of growing students, even though many of its students are starting at a low achievement level. And so you know that we've made some steps in the design of our system to account for this by emphasizing growth at an equal weight at achievement, but also in terms of looking at all of our schools. When we looked at all of our schools, there are only about a dozen schools that actually have this scenario play out for them. So just wanted to contextualize.
How do you define those terms, low achievement and high growth?
Yeah, so in terms of low, meaning like if you think of thirds, anyone that's going to be under a third is going to be in the sort of low general category. And again, like this isn't mathematical.
Low achievement in the bottom 33% of our total schools, or scoring below.
I think when we get to the specific example of a school, I'll be able to give you a sense of what that looks like. But when we're saying low, like it's not under 50%. Because that would be hard for all of our schools.
Because I think where we set these benchmarks determines how we classify schools. So we need to have a conversation about where these thresholds are set.
Yeah. So let me see if when we get to the specific example it makes sense for each of these. We wanted to give you a a global sense of the universe we're looking at before diving into sort of a specific comparison, but it's a fair point. So with that, just high level, when we're talking about these sorts of scenarios, many of the schools that have low achievement and high growth land in the overall 3-star category, and none that are in a high growth situation have 1 star, which again is the lowest rating. So to look at a specific example of 2 schools side by side, you'll see that we pulled out a couple of the measures that are part of the system. So here you're seeing that School A and School B, in both of these schools, fewer than 10% of students are scoring above the 4 level on PARCC ELA, and fewer than 10% of students, 20% of students are scoring at that college and career ready level for math. So sort of comparable achievement levels happening in both of these schools. What you'll see is that there's a difference in how School B has growth. So whereas School A is under the state average for both its median growth percentile for ELA and math, which is just one of the growth measures we're using in our system, School B is just under the state average for ELA and significantly above the state average for math. And as a result, you'll see that the overall rating recognizes School B by giving it an overall rating of 3 stars. Joe, does that help to contextualize a little bit more what we're talking about when we say low?
I still think it's subjective.
It absolutely is, and just one thing I'll point out is part of why we have proposed a system where that way that you allocate points is a continuous scale is for exactly that reason. So we're not actually drawing hard cuts that are threshold. So this idea of low achieving is just to give you all a sense in a profile. That's not actually a term that's defined in our accountability plan, and it has a specific amount of points allocated to it. So basically, like a school that has, the way our system is set up, a school that scores at 10%, has 10% of their students scoring at a certain level in PARCC versus a school that has 12% of students, they get a different number of points. Anytime, it's a continuous scale, so any difference in performance gets you more or less points. Does that make sense? Versus like a hard cut saying between 0 and 10 is low, you will get 0 points. Between 11 and 20 is medium, you get 5 points.
So first of all, this is very helpful. Thank you very, very much. Let me ask you a couple questions. So looking at the low achievement, high growth, because you're right, that's what there's been a lot of the concern around. So, all right, so the PARCC ELA is less than 10% 4+. The math is less than 20% 4+. And are you assuming nobody at 3+?
No, we just didn't include the 3+ data.
So no points are being awarded for 3+.
No, points are being awarded. It's just
we just didn't
for
show
the,
that data
for the
point.
sake of the scenario. For this is showing.
Are the 2 schools somewhat similar in the 3+ category as well, or is there a substantial difference there?
I believe so, because we picked a scenario where the difference between the schools specifically was in the growth bar. So, there's lots of domains in our measures, and actually looking at data and finding one where the only difference is 1 point is challenging, so we just focused on the piece that was most different here.
So I have a question. So how's this curved? So are schools that are considered at the top, are they going to be getting 5 stars, or do you think no schools are worthy of that 5-star rating? Are you going to just give them what you think, or are the schools at the top put in a cap?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're not doing a set bell curve. The way we've proposed that the thresholds would fall on actual points is that anything from 0 to 19.9 points, anything up to 19.9 points would be 1 star, and then 20 to 39.9 would be 2 stars, etc. But we have set those thresholds based on having at least some schools in all 5 categories. So it's not a forced bell curve. There doesn't need to be the same number of 5-star schools each year. One of the big things is actually we think that having 5 different levels will allow us to see improvement in schools over time as they move up in star levels. But there's not we have set them, like, it's not like we would have 0 5-star schools. There would be a number of schools at each level.
So to come back to this, so in school B, so part of my question is, all right, so we don't know how many points the 3+ are getting, I'm just saying. What I'm trying to figure out is if you have, to what extent does this answer the question, if you have a school where, let's say, the 4+ on ELA, I mean, we have a lot of schools that have 0 for ELA, and a lot of schools with 0 for math. So I guess.
There are a lot that are at 0.
At 0 fours?
Yes, I don't think there are a lot. There are a few.
Again, I think that's subjective.
Yeah.
Well, no, you can look
No,
at
no,
the
no,
first
you can-
ones
you
and
can
see
look- you
about
can look that up.
0 fours.
The term a lot is subjective.
Anyway, I guess, my question is, if you have schools, I mean, if there's only 1 or 2, then I agree, that's not a lot, but if you have schools that have no 4s, or under 10% 4s, both in ELA and in math, and let's say on the math, and I mean, you did the mid-40s for the ELA, but if you lowered the math to just above average, but not at 70s, would you still end up with a 3-star? Because that's, I mean, I think, I just want to say, to the extent that you can really say a school that's low achievement and high growth ends up with 3 stars, I think that's what a lot of people have been trying to push for. So I appreciate the effort very much. I'm just trying to understand the extent to which it holds up and the extent to which it doesn't, and how we can get new modeling to show that. That's sort of where I'm kind of.
And I think just going back, if you could go back one slide, Jesse. So again, the actual percent of 4+, the actual MGPs vary across these schools, but generally when we bucketed about 12 schools that fell into this category, 11 of them ended up with a 3-star rating, 1 of them had a 2-star, none of them had a 1-star rating. So you can see with a range of scores, that's generally where they fell.
Within those 12 schools, did we see any substantial differences on some of the other factors that are included in the model beyond the testing? Because for me, that's also instructive as to how we would target interventions. If we've got a school that's doing great at in-seat attendance, that tells us that may be something other schools need, and on through these other measures. So I'm somewhat wondering if we really break this out factor by factor, is it instructive in how we can target interventions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one reason why we have different measures included, so that you can see that transparently across all the measures. I think it might also be helpful to go on to the other scenarios we prepared, which get into the school environment category a little bit more.
We can come back to the extent that we need to. So just to run another sort of 2 pieces of the system side by side, if we're looking at a school that has low achievement but scores high on the environment ratings, we again have incorporated school environment as 15% of schools overall score for elementary and middle schools and 25% for high schools. And in looking at our current data, 27 schools fell into a scenario where they had lower achievement and strong environment. And when we see how these schools are rated overall, 60% of them had a 3-star rating and 35% of them had a 2-star rating. So again, none of these schools with strong environment fell into a 1-star situation.
What about growth? You were saying lower growth forming, are you talking about growth and hard outcome, or just hard outcome?
In this version, we just looked at achievement and school environment. So they could have a range of growth ratings.
That seems hard to believe. Wait, so, just playing this out, because it's only affects, unless they're all high school, it's only affects 15% of the overall score. So if you were low achievement, how could you get to 3 stars unless you also had some kind of high
Yeah,
growth, right?
they may have had higher.
Yes. Yeah. This is not precluding anyone from having high growth. The idea is just, if part of what we're concerned about is that environment may not have enough of an impact on the system, this is showing that, well, that people can have environment and there's still a range, because, you know, most schools fell within 3 or 2 stars, but that it did have an impact on their overall rating. And we'll look at, I think the specific example was helpful last time, so let me pivot to that one and then we can come back to this slide if necessary. So here again, we're looking at 2 schools side by side, so school A has low achievement, low growth, and weak environment. School B has low achievement, low growth, and strong environment. Again, in the overall situation, there could be a high growth school board, so I don't want that to be too confusing, but it's hard to look at two things at a time. And so here you'll see that what we're reviewing in terms of their growth and achievement scores are similar, but you'll see that there starts to be a difference in the environment ratings. So in seat attendance, in 90% or more attendance, and in re-enrollment, there's a difference between how School A and School B are doing. So School A is lower in ISA, in 90% attendance, and in re-enrollment. And so because of the outperformance that we see for School B, it is rated higher on the overall star category.
And I should just say here again that low, I think in this context, is a relative term, right? These are not super low numbers relative to the state average. But two schools that have similar achievement ratings, similar growth ratings, but different in-school environment, you can see that their overall rating is different, which shows that the environment category is coming in. 200 minutes.
Yeah, sure. It does also show that the way that we're weighting our scores indicates our belief that the environmental factors are significantly less important than the academic. I already know, obviously, we're doing it because of the percentages, but if we actually thought that strong environment was super highly correlated with outcomes for students, the schools that have a really great environment should have at least 3 stars. You know what I mean? So what we're saying by this, what I'm reading from that, and tell me if my logic isn't flowing, but is that we actually are saying we don't believe as much that strong environment means stronger school. Because, right?
I think we're saying that strong environment in the absence of other outcomes, either growth or achievement, does not mean it's a great school.
And what we've seen in the data is that it can be a leading indicator sometimes, but also sometimes not. So
Or it has to be.
And I'd argue that test score is a lagging indicator, so, I mean, my question here though, without knowing the 3+ and where that rates, does the environmental issues really tip the scale between 1 star and 2 stars on these schools, or do they fall at 18 and 21 and it's that part 3 category that bumps it up? So can we say with certainty that this environmental factor is the difference between the 1 star and the 2 star here?
in this particular scenario, we picked it because everything else was similar except for the school environment ratings. If we look at all 27 schools that fall into this scenario, that's part of the design of having a system with multiple measures, is that schools are going to be tipped to different ratings for different reasons, and we want that to happen.
Right, but I'm questioning the degree that school climate is actually influencing the results. Is it just 2 points? Is it a minor thing? Or is it enough that really is instructive to us?
Yeah, I mean, in this scenario in particular, that is the reason why these schools were different, but there could be other ways that a school could also change, so I want to be transparent on that. So we also looked at how many schools fell into a scenario of being high achievement with weak environment, and actually found, and this is a little bit to your point, Laura, that there actually weren't schools that were high achievement with weak environment ratings. But we did look to see what was the situation of the weakest environment rating of a high achieving school, and found that school still scored moderately well at 3 stars.
Again, not at 5, right?
Yeah, but it wasn't enough.
And how are you defining high achievement here? Is that part score of 40 plus?
We were looking at both
50%
4 and
or-
3 plus, like,
Okay.
generally in the upper, tier of performance again. Since it's not a defined term in the system, there isn't like a hard test that works.
So can you just give us your own personal synopsis about why these models make you feel like, yep, I think we have the right proposal? So, and specifically, I've written down this question to Joe's earlier comment, do we want to weigh leading indicators more than trailing outcomes in saying that a school's high quality and communicating that to the public? Keeping in mind that even leading indicators is not a comprehensive set of leading indicators, right? Like the research associated with the environment doesn't say attendance is sufficient, right? So I even caution at my own question, because you would want a comprehensive set of the 5 things that have been known to create an environment where a school is in turnaround status, and that isn't what we have. But anyway, I'd love to just hear like your philosophical.
Thank you for asking it much more eloquent.
Yeah, I would say there's 2 big underlying questions, I think. One is I think in the realm that you were getting at. I think the other one that we've heard most frequently from the board before today was this idea of if there is a low achieving school that has high growth, how does that school fare, right? And I think that on that point, we want to understand. And I will say, I think I've heard 2 reasons for bringing up sort of the weights between achievement and growth and the overall weight of achievement and growth in the system. One is this question of are we weighting growth appropriately relative to achievement? And the other one I think is, we hear that there are concerns generally about testing, and is there a message we're sending based on the overall weight that we're putting on testing? I think on the first point, the results that we've shown here are why we feel like weighting achievement and growth equivalently, equally, is actually appropriate in our field, and why we haven't proposed something else. When it comes to the overall weight that's put on both achievement and growth, I wanted to put the question back onto the board just to see, are we capturing that right as part of this sort of symbolism of having multiple measures that are based on achievement, but that are based on the same assessments, weighted at the total weight they are. Is that the primary concern? Does this address the first concern of the weight of growth versus the weight of achievement, or are there other concerns that we're missing? And I should say, Laura, that this is all why we have continued to feel that our proposal is appropriate, but as I think I've conveyed to most, if not all of you, that we've not said that that decision is final. We just think it merits further discussion, which is why we didn't make a change prior to releasing the draft proposal on Monday.
Have you all run a scenario where you have a difference instead of 40-40, where you have a 30-50 for weight and achievement 30, just to see what the difference would be, if any, for the schools that show growth, a lot of growth, but maybe at a 1 move and they have moved their children to a 2. That's a lot of growth in 1 year for a school. And are they getting what they really deserve? So have you done
Yeah,
that?
we've looked at that a little bit, and I will say, again, one thing is that the schools that have high growth, you can see, are faring pretty well in our system. None of them are a 1-star rating, only 1 is a 2-star, and most are actually 3 stars, so landing in the middle, even if they have overall low achievement, because of their high growth. So we agree that high growth matters a lot, we want to recognize it, and we think our system does that right now. When it comes to weighting growth more than achievement, it actually does it seems to skew the data quite a bit, or change the data quite a bit in a way that we did not feel comfortable changing.
Can you share more details?
I don't have it offhand, but it made really big swings.
Two things. One, I hope we can get more as sort of in writing so we can look at it. Very, very helpful. But I want to go back, because, and I may be missing something on this. So, when you say there's only 13 schools that are high achievement, low growth, what is I think that was the number, my point. Well,
You mean high growth, low achievement?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
No,
It's just like
no. High, low achievement, high growth, is that what you said? Yeah.
You said that.
Okay,
You
sorry.
low and high
Okay,
backwards, and I was
anyway,
like, maybe you know something I don't know.
Okay, so there's only 12 in that category. So my question is, what is the definition of low achievement and the definition of high growth to come up with that 12?
Yeah, and again, we didn't have hard and fast cuts. It was generally around the bottom third of performance when it came to achievement, and on growth, what, top third?
I think there was top third, yeah, because part of this was trying to find similar schools that were similar in every other way, so we didn't want to set like a hard cut, because then there were too many other, there was too much noise, for example. So generally think of it as thirds.
So, and I think it's very hard to do this without being able to see more more of them wrapped out with more of the data. Just want to say that. So if a school was, let's say, in the bottom 10 percentile or bottom 10 to 20 percentile on achievement and above average growth, and did you also factor in the subgroups?
Yeah, the subgroups are fully.
The subgroup, and so we're assuming the subgroups have sort of the lower scores that we're talking about.
It's based on actual subgroup results.
Okay, all right, so a school that was, say, in the bottom 10th percentile, let's start with that, and in the 50th to 60th growth percentile. So in the bottom, the lowest achieving, and better than half of the schools in terms of growth. Do we know where that would fall here? And let's say for now that it would have strong environments.
I don't think we know, and I'm not sure that there's a school that falls in that exact parameter, right? Like, this is based on where schools actually fell, and you can see even based on this example, School B had a MGP score for ELA. Their growth score was actually below the state average, but because they had a higher math MGP score, they were ultimately a school that we considered high growth, right? And so in that case, even though their achievement was low, very similar to School A's, and their ELA MGP was actually, I don't know that if we were only looking at the ELA MGP, we would have considered it a high growth school, because it did so strong on math MGP, it ended up in the 3-star category.
So let me just see if I understand. So your low growth, your low achievement, high growth, you're pulling from the third of schools across the city with the lowest scores. So that's a lot of schools. I mean, it's a third of the schools. And of those, only 13 of them have in the top third growth.
Only 12 of them.
Only 12, I'm sorry. You can see on math, is it? Have the top 12 only are in the top third. So then my question would be, what about the next third, I guess, is sort of. The next third of the high growth. Because again, going back to this issue of if you have the proficiency levels are low, but it's a school that is at least doing as well as half of the other schools, it's at least at the 50th percentile. And that's a kind of school that I would worry about tagging on.
That's average growth.
It's
If you're at
above,
50%.
well, above. So
MGP
above
is
50. No, I'm saying so above 50. So this is really above 65. So I'm saying in that 50 to 66, what would happen to a school that was?
Yeah,
I'm just trying to make sense. I mean, I'm just trying to make sense of it. It's hard without having.
yeah. I can't give you the exact math of how, where that school would fall. I think one thing that might be helpful is just going to another part of our accountability proposal, which is on the next slide. So I'm actually just going to go back. As a reminder on the school ratings, what we were proposing is that we would do these star ratings levels 1 through 5 and issue them annually. One of the differences, sorry, we go to just the star. So we would do these star ratings from 1 star to 5 stars and issue those annually. One difference from in our accountability proposal from how the waiver accountability system worked is under the waiver, priority and focus categories were both the overall rating for the school and they determined the school improvement trajectory, right? So they determined the sort of what would happen to your school to help you improve. Under our new proposal is actually to separate those two purposes. So to separate what the overall rating is from how the school intervention works out. And so the star ratings, again, are that overall rating. They're issued annually, and they're this 1 star to 5 star system that we've been talking about. The school improvement categories, which are similar, ESSA requires similar categories called now comprehensive support instead of priority and targeted support instead of focus, would actually be determined differently. We would identify schools for comprehensive and targeted support every 3 years instead of every year. And that would allow us, and we would stick to, under ESSA, we actually were identifying priority schools far above the number that we were required to. Generally, people were identifying the bottom 5% of schools as priority. In DC, we were identifying quite a, I can't remember, but yeah, 30 or 40 schools
Number of schools with
double or triple what we were required to identify. Under this, we would identify just the minimum number we needed to, with the rationale that doing it, only identifying it every 3 years and only sticking to the bottom numbers that we are required to identify will allow us to really concentrate our focus and our funding in truly the most struggling schools and give them the best shot of actually improving. So we know that one of our challenges as a city has been, we've been, I think, in some ways paying attention to too many schools. Not that all schools don't need to improve, but we haven't seen real progress in sort of the bottom schools, I think, in part because we haven't given truly dedicated focus to them. So when we're talking about, for example, this comprehensive support category, which is the bottom 5% of schools, we're looking at about 10 schools across the city. And we focus just on those, not just, but like we focus primarily on those 10 schools for 3 years. So concentrating our school improvement dollars, our federal school improvement dollars, and thinking about a bunch of other levers that we can use to focus support. So one of the things we've heard as a great idea from another state is actually that we've put those schools at the top of our list within OSSE in terms of just any time they need help from us. Like they reach out, let's say one of those schools is having an issue with their national school lunch program, right? Donna Anthony's team has that list of schools. They know, like, they're going to try and be responsive to all schools, but that school reaches out. They're the ones we're going to get to first. We're going to come and help them. We're going to come and solve their issue. A teacher from that school has a licensure issue. We bump them to the top of the list and get it sorted out so that that teacher can get back to focusing on their students. Just we think about all the ways that we can bring OSSE's focus and supports, both through money and through attention. So those schools would submit plans and apply for funding. But part of why I draw this out, Ruth, is again, even within that one-star category, we're not identifying all one-star schools as the schools in need of comprehensive support. We would look at just the bottom 5%. And so we're looking at, again, at about 10 schools.
That's right. That's gonna, well, it's gonna cause a lot of concern. It's a one-star school not getting such support. And it might make, part of what, presumably there's a real difference between the one stars that you're going to identify and the one stars that you're not. Maybe that needs to be recognized. Maybe they're not one stars, so there's a reason they're not in the bottom.
So I think that, again, it's not that we're not concerned about any school that's in a one star, but I think it's also about being realistic so that we see a real chance that schools will improve, right? We're talking about schools that have really entrenched challenges.
It's a very nice plan.
And so our hope is that out of those 10 schools that we identify for comprehensive support, we see real changes over that 3-year period.
And what if you don't?
I'm
Sorry, what if you don't see real change?
Yeah, so one of the things under ESSA is a requirement that you give a period of time for an LEA, and this is somewhat similar to under the waiver, that there's a period of time in which the LEA can lead the improvement strategy. They can compete for grant funding and then put in place their own plan with the school for how to improve. But if they don't improve after that set period of time, which we've said is 3 years, or if you're showing improvement at the end of that 3 years, even if you haven't exited yet, you could earn an additional 4th year. So between either 3 or 4 years of time that's LEA-led, the ESSA requires a quote-unquote more rigorous state intervention to happen. And what we spell out in our draft plan, I think it's section 4.3C, if you want to look at it, is that what we would do for that more rigorous intervention is that OSSE would actually convene a process by which we invited proposals for more substantial intervention. Those proposals could come either from the LEA that was already leading the school, but would need to be different and beyond the work that they'd already been doing, or it could also come from other organizations. And that OSSE would convene a community process to make sure that the community had input into vetting those proposals and could think about the specific context of the school and what kind of intervention would best fit the context of that school. And then OSSE would ultimately determine which of those interventions would happen.
Okay, then I have a follow-up. There's just so much need, especially if you're in a one-star school. So I just have a lot of concern. I understand the rationale behind it and but focusing on only 10 schools for 3 solid years makes me very uncomfortable because there is a lot of need for, schools 11 through 25, let's say. And also just focusing on specifically those 10 for 3 years, and then starting year 4, you will theoretically have 10 brand new schools. Is there any way to add a rolling system or something? Please.
Or who's to say that there's any solid evidence that actually focusing on the most challenging schools, and I don't know what kinds of resources you're talking about, is actually gonna turn those schools versus focusing on the 3 stars and making them all 4 stars. And with a more dispersed strategy, I feel like we as a system have put in place these measures where I don't know, I just think like there are also, in the schools that are performing at 40% proficiency, which is a huge chunk of our schools, like 60% of those kids are not getting the support they need, but they might need just a little support, so that like $1 that you put towards them that would require $100 in another situation, you go to 100 kids and bump them across the line versus be focused on moving a tiny speck forward in a deeply entrenched school versus frankly looking at the public charter school board, and if they see a school that's a tier 3 for 3 years, they close it down. And I don't know, I'm just throwing out there, I have a huge concern that I feel like we ignore the middle a lot. And I know like there are resources and they're finite, and so we've got to decide, right? But I'm curious about why are we deciding that, given where our system is right now and the dearth of supply that is meeting parent demand for at least mediocrely decent 3 and 4 star schools.
So let me say a couple.
I think we're on the same page, the same issue. Having been in DC public schools and having been in turnaround schools, that we would have to develop our own plan. That almost never worked. If the plan isn't developed by an outside person, it's almost doomed to fail. And to have the school struggling for another 3 years just seems redundant, useless, and puts our children back another 3 years. So if we're going to go with something like that, we need to have a plan to help them make a plan and allocate resources across the system, and maybe help some of the other schools that are on the cusp too.
And if I can just, I'll pile on a little bit.
I would love to talk at some point.
This is a critical point. There are numbers of schools that have been failing for 20 years. And we need to have a plan. And they're not going to be the bottom 10 schools. I can go through Ward 6 and identify 3 or 4 of them that probably aren't going to be in the bottom 10, but are struggling immensely. And we've got to have a plan for those schools too. And the other entities have not been responsive, especially DCPS, in developing true turnaround plans. So I would love to find a way that we can leverage the data that we're collecting to ensure that we're able to identify those leading indicators and invest in those.
Okay, great. Let me try and tackle. I will say that I think I want to just share some of our thinking, because I think it gets at a number of the points that you all are raising. So I'll start there, and then we can talk further about, so just in terms of our thinking, so part of this is based on, I think, experience that we've seen in other states around how not just the direct resources to the bottom 5% of schools, but also how having a concentrated focus on them and seeing real improvement there and using data and information and community involvement and pressure can actually drive pressure for change throughout the rest of the system. So I'll tell you that in Tennessee, for example, Memphis City Schools was always the lowest performing LEA and had the lowest performing schools. And the truth was that Nashville was only just above that, but they always felt better because they could look at Memphis and say, at least we're not Memphis, right? And so the first time Tennessee ran the bottom 5% list, the priority schools list, it was 83 schools across the state, 69 of them were in Memphis. And then after several years, the next time we ran the priority list 3 years later, what we saw was, the threshold for what, like at that point, priority was just based on test scores, right? So the proficiency rate that got you into priority status had moved up by 10 or 15 points from the original time. And Memphis had something like 10 schools fewer on the priority list, and Nashville went from having 5 schools on it to having 15 schools on it, right? So Memphis had 10 fewer, Nashville had 10 more. And all of a sudden, Nashville sat up and said, oh my gosh, they got better, our schools stayed the same, none of our schools exited, right? And it put this like incredible pressure on Nashville to act in a different way. And Chattanooga had a couple more schools, and they were like, wow, we need to get our act together. A rural district outside Memphis suddenly had a school, and they were like, this is different. And so even though it was a concentrated focus on the bottom 5%, by seeing actual movement in them, it actually put pressure on the rest of the system as well. So I think that's one reason for this idea. I think another reason for it is, while Karen, I agree that in many cases we've seen school developed plans not lead to success, and there's been some new research recently around the SIG program and how it's played out, that's one of the reasons for the more rigorous state intervention being there. That again, one of the things we've seen in other places is that one scenario that leads to actual improvement happening during that LEA-led intervention period is knowing that something real and serious is coming at the end of it, which is the line that we're trying to walk with the more rigorous interventions. Not that we're trying to be respectful and open to different ideas around what will improve, but be really clear that it's going to be something serious and that the state gets to direct it at that point. And then, Laura, to your point around the public charter school board's actions, none of what we are describing would preclude the charter board from continuing to take action on the lowest performing charter schools. They made very clear they want to continue to be aggressive about their performance. And so we anticipate that will continue. And if they were to close a school, then that would obviously, they would fall out of our system at that point. If though a charter school had not been acted on by the charter board, then they would go through the same process. So the more rigorous state intervention would apply for them as well. And similarly, at that point, then the charter LEA could submit its own proposal, or other organizations could also submit proposals around what the school should look like. On the point that you all are raising, that there are schools outside of the bottom 5% that also need to improve and need support and resources to do that, we agree. So one other thing is, I touched on the targeted support category, which is in some ways similar to focus. So targeted support is based on if you have particular groups of students in your school, subgroups of students who are at a low level. That's how it's defined in the state law, or in ESSA. And I will say just that ESSA has 3 different ways you can be targeted support. It gets super confusing. We try and lay them out clearly in a chart in the state plan. We can point you to that section if you want to see it. But generally, the idea is identifying those schools that have a subgroup that is low performing. So that will capture another set of schools. We don't know exactly how many yet, but it will capture another significant set. And there's not a set percentage recommended for those. It's just any school whose subgroup falls under the same performance threshold. So that's one thing. And we are also thinking about resources and supports for those targeted support schools as well. But the other thing I'll say is one of the things that we're very serious about in our plan is the kinds of professional development and technical assistance we're offering to all schools. So OSSI does a lot of trainings right now, but we're thinking about how to ramp those up even further. So we're thinking about being even more serious about our human capital strategy. We have a number of LEAs that represent actually about 90% of the schools in DC who are participating in something called the Staffing Data Collaborative, where they're working with a partner, they're working with TNTP in a contract funded by OSSI to look closely at their data around their own teachers, their evaluation data, the experience levels, the preparation, and to take serious action where needed to help those teachers improve. Again, there's a whole section of the plan that's around excellent educators or educator equity that talks about some of these strategies, and we're thinking about additional strategies like that. We're thinking about how to improve the level of the professional development that we're providing, building on some of the stuff we're already doing, but investing even more in it, and making sure that my goal is that over time that actually LEA's view and our strategies actually are a key lever towards hitting their goals. So that actually participating in these trainings is not just a good thing to do, that they actually see that making a difference in their overall ratings and their indicators. And that's how seriously we're taking the kind of support we provide to all schools. And so in many ways, we're trying to think both about what is our strategy for all schools and helping all schools improve, and also then what is our concentrated focus on the bottom 5%. And then just one other point around sort of what happens to schools if they're in between these 3-year cycles of identification. We're again thinking really seriously about the levers we have to put pressure and bring information and data to bear. So again, one of the strategies we're borrowing from Tennessee is, in Tennessee, even though we ran our list every 3 years, every year we sent letters to schools, and we sent a bunch of different ones in different categories. We'd send a letter and say, hey, just so you know, if we ran the list this year, you would have been in the bottom 5%. And we are running it officially in 2 years, so just know that, be looking seriously. We'd send a letter that said, hey, just so you know, if we run the list this year, you would have been in the 6th to 10th percentile. You were just above the threshold, and the schools in the bottom 5% are getting better. So just know that that is common, and you should work seriously on how to improve. We'd send a similar list to the focus schools, to the targeted support schools. And one of the things we've thought about too in our strategy is how can we involve, one of the things that the Public Charter School Board has done that has been among the most effective and smart things is not just engage the charter LEA staff, but also the board of the charter LEAs and have board-to-board conversations, which just engages the board as well and puts their pressure on, and we're thinking about how we can do something similar, right? So get this information, send these letters, not only to the charter LEA staff, but to their board as well, so they can engage.
You do something similar with the DCPS where you refer to the independent boards of the school council.
Yeah, we could think about the LSATs, yeah.
That'd be helpful.
Quick question. In regards to some of these triggers and some of the mediation that you want to do, have you or are you going to provide guidance to both DCPS and the Charter School Board around how to work within kind of those interventions? Because I mean, when it comes to DCPS, I know there's a lot of concern with personnel turnover, both teachers and principals. And then on the charter side, you know, if a 5-year review comes in within that 3-year period, is OSSE advising those various LEAs on how to handle situations like that? Because, you know, we would hate to see for instance, a charter school in Ward 8 close midstream, you know, if they were going to make significant progress, you know, given these interventions, right?
Yeah, so while we can't, the charter board is an independent entity, obviously, but we are talking a lot with them about how we can coordinate our efforts so that we're staying aligned, right? So if we see a school that is improving, hopefully that we can both stay in touch about that and stay in touch about sort of what time period then made sense, either under OSCE's state school intervention timeline or under the charter renewal timeline. And yes, similarly, we would stay in close touch with DCPS to make sure our strategies were not in conflict with what the LEA was doing. I think just one other point that Jesse was reminding me of is another big part of our strategy is around how we can celebrate and recognize schools for a range of different things. And again, the power of that in driving improvement as well, right? And recognizing for a large range of categories. So recognizing our 5-star schools based on the overall rating, but also looking at recognizing, and we don't have a definitive list yet, so we love ideas around this, but we thought about things like recognizing the schools with the highest growth, recognizing the schools that make the most improvement on any given area, right? Recognizing those schools that have really high alternate graduation metric rates. So those schools that are really doing a great job of serving students 6- and 7-year graduates, right? 5-, 6-, and 7-year graduates, how can we recognize those folks? And keeping not just like a vague idea of those, but actually generating a definitive list, getting input from folks on the things that they think are most important to recognize, and then doing things like creating banners, right? And sending letters of recognition to the charter board or to the LSAT, and doing like just some more formal, doing press releases, etc. Just doing actual formalized recognition to show folks that there's a range of ways to thrive in the system as well.
So I think that my biggest takeaway from this discussion is that there are so many complex factors that go into the star rating that that it becomes a bit complicated in a sense. So I guess my question for you guys is, what are your plans for? So let's say that hypothetically you find that this plan isn't working, or you find that there are many flaws in the plan moving forward, which I think is pretty inevitable because you're going to discover as it moves forward that maybe there are things that aren't working. So my question for you guys is, what are your in what ways do you plan to address flexibility? Do you think that you can change the plan if issues arise? And, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of thoughts on that. So one thing is we are planning this fall to run for internal understanding and planning purposes what the system would look like if it were to be official, right? So we're not officially releasing results until fall 18, but running it for planning and understanding purposes this fall, and in part to see, was there something unanticipated that we didn't think of in the process that's causing the results to be skewed in some weird way, and still having some time to correct that before the official results come out. So that's one thing. The other thing is we specifically cited in our draft plan that by the 18-19 school year, we will step back and review our full accountability system. And we can do that in partnership with you all to first vet if there are additional metrics that we're ready to include at that point that we weren't ready to include on the front end. And also it's a good chance to step back on the system as a whole. The other thing I would just say is while I acknowledge that our system is complex and there's a lot of different facets to it, I think one thing that is instructive is thinking about the PMF that the PCSB has used, and which is I think similarly complex in many ways. It's not that while it's complex, that A, it's become part of educators' vocabulary in the charter sector as they've gotten used to it and used it consistently for 5 years. But secondly, also that it's very much penetrated the vocabulary and the understanding that parents use when they're choosing schools. And it's not that parents necessarily understand all the nuances of how it's calculated, but the tier 1, 2, 3 system has very much become part of that vocabulary, and they have trust that the tier ratings are playing out in a way that makes sense. And so similarly, part of our hope is having this very clear, transparent 1-star to 5-star system that's run annually and gives that clear information for parents, and keeping the school improvement sections, which frankly gets so complicated even just following the federal requirements, having that be around how we drive improvement. Not that any of that is hidden, these categories would still be reflected on the school report cards, but particularly on the targeted support categories, they get really nuanced and complicated, and so sort of using that on the educator side to really try and drive improvement.
Go back to just looking at the fact that you have the 10 low schools, and we have the group schools that may be at 3-star, but really not moving because it just, the growth isn't there. I think what Karen had was a good point, that those schools are going to need some level of support as well. And in visiting a school today, I realized that that support for that school, why they're growing, is because they just happen to have a principal that is very data driven, and she taught her staff how to, and in staff development or in development, when we're talking some form of staff development going on, how we can support that middle group, because a lot of times it isn't that they need the extreme, but it may be something as simple as coming in and showing everyone how to read the data.
I think a couple of thoughts on that. So one thing is, again, that we are thinking really seriously about the kinds of professional development and training we can offer, which I think could get at some of those points. But I think the other thing is, again, part of why we wanted to submit our plan at this first deadline is to have it approved prior to the start of the school year, but also so that we can be working really seriously on implementation in addition to design, right? And I think one of the key implementation points will be, how can we display all the data and metrics that are behind this plan in an understandable way to schools, so that even if I'm a 3-star school or even a 4-star school, even a 5-star school, if there are points of weakness in my data, that is evident and clear, and how can we develop the kinds of tools and templates that show that to folks really clearly, so that then, and how can they then look up, all right, so I'm a 4-star school, let's say, but when it turns out that on English language proficiency, for example, I'm really not doing well. Here's this school down the road where they might be a 3-star school, so they're rated lower than I am, but they're doing really well when it comes to English language proficiency and helping students acquire language, and I can go and talk to them. So part of it is the tools, so that tools themselves can do that, and then part of that is how we at OSSE are reviewing that data and helping make those connections as well. So reaching out and offering and saying, and the Public Charter School Board ideally, and DCPS too, using these kinds of data to say, hey, I look at across my DCPS middle schools, some of them are doing really well in these metrics, some are not, how can I partner them? So I think some of it is our state role, and some of it is the part that giving this information to other entities will also help them too.
And I was going to say that work is going to be led by what group of folks in your office? So who do you envision leading that work to connect schools with those resources?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a couple of teams. So I and my front office are going to continue to remain very involved in SI and accountability and implementation. Our elementary, secondary, and specialized education team, SE, led by Amy Maestera, will be deeply involved, and part of this is they've been thinking about how to incorporate multiple performance factors in what they've been calling a risk-based monitoring framework, where schools that are high risk get much more intensive monitoring, and schools that are low risk get less monitoring. It's not exactly the same as our accountability ratings, because you have to take fiscal factors into account for a framework like that, but they will also look at performance factors. And then the third group that will be involved in this is our data assessment and research team, which right now has limited capacity to do analysis and research to support schools, but we're working to build that capacity. So have them spend less time on just required federal reporting and more time on things like supporting schools and understanding their data.
So all the data is 1 year, because we only have 1 year. Is the plan to continue annual, so there's not a tail on the data, so it's 1 year data?
Yeah, it's a great question. That is our plan for the annual STAR ratings because they're issued annually. There's an open question, I think, about the comprehensive support schools since we're running that every 3 years. For the first time, we will run it only based on 1 year of data since it's a new system for everyone. But I think there's a question for the second time we run it, whether we might do it based on multiple years of data, and we're open and feedback.
But on that too, as we get to a report card, having multiple years of stars would be instructive for parents. Is the school growing? Is it changing? Which way is it trending?
Yeah.
And also your ELL example, school A is better. That's something we need to make sure is clear to the parents as well, whether that's in the report card or whatever else. And I would go one step further and say that's why whether it's in the STAR system or it's in the report card, this is our opportunity to get true data about culture, climate, other programs that we can then use to instruct parents so they make the right choice as to what school is best for their family and their kids. And I know there's been a lot of back and forth. How do we measure some of these things? Do we include a survey? At some level, this is our opportunity to get that data. And I want to make sure that I'm on record, my constituents have been hitting me over the head, that we get that data so families can make the right choice. We live in an environment of choice. We embrace that. Let's help parents make the right choice. That's my plea.
Yeah, I think just 2 thoughts on that. So on the report card, yes, absolutely, in terms of making transparent the performance of different groups of students. It's one of the reasons, if you remember, why we plan to run our framework for the all students group and then run it separately for each subgroup so that it's that transparent and easy, and we're thinking about that in terms of display as well, and then how we aggregate all that into the overall rating. On your second point about climate, I think that's right, and one of the things you all will see is in our draft state plan that while we reiterate the reasons why we're not including it for points in the formal accountability system at this point, we have committed in the draft state plan to organizing a pilot of schools that would opt in, and a part of that pilot, I think, would be looking at publicly reporting that data and exploring what it would look like to include for accountability in the future. So we're interested in that, and we've described that in the state plan.
Really quickly, what was your thought process behind having 5 stars as opposed to, say, 3, which the charter board already does, or 6, or putting the bottom 10 in their own subcategory?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I would say there's not necessarily magic to it, but one of the great ways we arrived at it was actually in conversations with the public charter school board, that while there are 3 formal tiers in their system, that actually they realize that there's sort of 5 levels at which they tend to think about schools. So tier 1 is tier 1, but then within tier 2, people tend to talk about high tier 2 and low tier 2 schools and make a distinction there, so it's sort of like 2 categories. And then within tier 3, the public charter school board actually has a threshold, a lower threshold within tier 3 at which they could automatically close a school. So it's sort of like they have a distinction there too. So they sort of said, look, we already sort of functionally have 5 levels. And also in DC, given that we have about 200 schools, it seemed like having 5 categories would sort of bucket schools into numbers that would make sense for parents too. So that was our thought there.
I have a super quick question, and I know Ruth has one and we need to get going right here. So, speaking in terms of the school report card, I have a thought, and I've shared it with Ruth, that just came up this week, is the concern that a lot of my parents have. All of my schools, save one, are DCPS schools. I don't have a high charter number in my ward as others do. Is there any way that we could require, either through the school report card or through the state accountability plan, more transparency on how many standardized assessments an LEA is giving groups of students, to just make it transparent? Because I think there are DCPS schools that are giving more standardized assessments than perhaps some of the charter schools, and there might be some charters that are just getting more standardized tests than others. And that's what I keep hearing from my constituents, is that there's an article from Valerie Giblow that Bruce shared with me, that DCPS middle school is getting a STAMP, SAGE, PARC, NAEP, ANET, Math Standards Mastery, iReady, Diagnostic, SRI3, MAP2, and NGS as standardized assessments throughout.
standardized assessment, the iReady and the ANET, those are all just progress tests, like you would get a spelling test.
So, okay.
I mean, you have to, every
Because
teacher
I mean, a
has to
couple of things I
know.
had not heard of.
Well, what I would say is it's
Measuring
standardized
growth.
in the sense that everybody has to give it regular intervals. And so what happens, what we hear a lot about, I know, because objectives of, is that the amount of testing, the redundancy of the testing, the constancy of it really interferes.
Yeah.
And I
So
agree,
it's
some of them are
regular.
diagnostic, but they're very redundant and they're all just.
And it stops instruction for the period of time where the students are taking those.
As a student, like from my perspective, it's constant interruptions, like significantly impede our learning.
Yeah, so I think, we can talk further. I don't think I have an immediate answer.
And I don't expect one.
The one thing I would flag on this is, that one of the things that's challenging is because the tests are given, they're given for different purposes, as Laura was flagging.
Yep.
And I think in some ways, the line does get blurry between what's just a like routine unit test that's given in a school or a weekly quiz that a teacher gives versus a formative assessment versus a, so that those purposes I think do get blurry. And then the second thing I would just say is that many of these things are not actually the same test being given to the same child.
Right,
So,
and I know the NAEP
like,
is every other year, and there's some
Right.
flexibility
And NAEP is a
within
sample,
this.
it's actually given to a sample of students. PARC and MSAA are two different tests, but no child takes both, right?
Right.
And so
So
they're-
this was just, the genesis of this, just for your edification, was a former PTA president saying, if I look at the calendar of assessments that my child is taking, there are just a ton of dates that are red.
Yeah.
And that my child is expected to take an assessment. I took quizzes, I took, a test on the history chapter, I took all of that, I get that. But I think that's what is concerning to my family.
Yeah, and I get the concern. I think my point is just that how to share the information in a way that is clear and is reflective of the reality that a child is experiencing can actually be a little bit trickier just because of those variations in how it's given.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna blast through a bunch of questions, you don't have to answer them all, but just to get them out there. First of all,
Thanks for
when
the
you sit down with us, whoever wants to, our committee or whoever, and sort of work with us to try to understand this modeling a lot more, and sort of get more examples, different examples, try to see what's going on.
We can try. I will say, like, we're managing a lot right now, as you all know, and I
This
think
modeling was all real schools, right?
it was real schools with all of the caveats we shared at the beginning around this being 1 year of data, preliminary numbers, et cetera.
So I'm just gonna say, I think it's very helpful, I'm so glad that you did it, I have 100 questions, and would be hard pressed, based on this, to be able to say, solves the problem, people, don't worry. And that's what either I'd like to get to, or be in a conversation with everybody about how to solve it, so that's number one. So can we talk about how to try to make that happen, given the.
We can talk about it.
Second is, maybe I'll send this to you. At the very beginning of this process, you raised the interesting question of how you were going to determine whether subgroups were above or were lagging, and there were different options, like were they lagging relative to other subgroups in the school, or were they lagging relative to the achievement of that same group across the city, et cetera, et cetera. It's a one sentence answer, you can answer, otherwise I can do it later as to how you're doing it.
Yeah, so I think those were sort of, it's not a one sentence.
Okay, let me just, we'll do it separately, but, the high schools, I'm not sure if any of these examples of the models were high schools, and that was, of course, a huge issue because there was no growth, you just sort of throw that in the model issue. Another question, what is the effect, the whole long-term goal issue, which keeps coming up in different ways? As I read the plan, to the extent that I sort of scanned it, it looks like those long-term goals live separately from the accountability. Is that correct, that they do not affect how schools are rated, it's more how, it's sort of a different way of looking at it?
That is primarily true. There is one tie, not in a numerical tie, but of the broad principle that we want all students to improve and the students who are furthest behind to improve faster is built into both our long-term goals and the accountability system. And we can say more about exactly how.
Okay, that would be important to know. And on the question, did you respond? remind you to our concerns about the climate and the non-testing, I have to say, you know, but I really appreciate the idea of going forward and doing the climate thing. I think the other issue is about the, kind of what I think of as sort of the broad curriculum, the whole child, and I don't think that's your sort of well-roundedness in social studies, the arts, et cetera, et cetera. So let me just put that down there. And
They did comment, did you see section 4.1? There's 2 paragraphs specifically directed towards school climate with a commitment to revisit it.
and the climate, but not the well-rounded curriculum. That's some separate one thing. I'm appreciating the climate stuff, but raising that is the other thing. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to the mission statement.
Well, can I just go back, this is, the proposed is replacing these 2, right?
Correct.
Can you remind me why we're changing it? Because these 2 seem much clearer than this.
It
Sorry
was,
to be like a total.
no, it's fine. The original thought came up during our strategic planning when we were talking about, revising and making it more clear about exactly what we do and the focus on the academic achievement and equity. And so that's where that came from. I mean, we can just leave it the way it is.
I mean, well, everybody else is having silent conversations. So I vote to leave it. This thing here says majority education stakeholders. That's like a tremendous flag.
Right, that was an addition from Ruth, and we can talk about taking that back out if you want.
That's like a huge issue, because that's like going exactly against what we're trying to accomplish with our community. Right?
Again, it was a proposal from one of the members, and
I
so.
think that, I don't think it changes our behavior to leave it.
Could folks take conversations outside, please? Sorry. And then I have a favor, real quick, of Jesse and Shauna. Do you have a second talk to Marcus as well? That follow up on.
Oh, the meeting.
I think a lot of people do, so do you want me to talk about it at all? Or,
Here, why don't we just get it out?
Okay.
I'm sorry. I
I'm
just
gonna
want to
go ahead and retake control of the meeting. We're gonna go back to ESSA and talk about the upcoming meetings. I'll turn it over to Aussie to start, and then some board members have questions. I'll let Marcus and Lynette start, and then we'll go around. So, whomever from Aussie would like to lead that discussion as well, we can kick it off.
Yeah, so give me like 5 minutes. So, we are excited to have all the meetings set with dates and times and locations published, and with flyers that I believe we have distributed to everyone. We have produced a PowerPoint deck that will help us lead the conversation, and our proposed plan for the meetings is to start with openings from the superintendent and from the state board member, an overview of the state plan, and I don't know, John Paul, because we sent it late, if it's up for other folks to see.
It is.
Okay, which we've done a lot of work on making accessible to people, but also bringing some supporting materials with more depth for those who might want it on specific kind of content. And then have that take up no more than half the meeting, depending on how interested and conversational the groups tend to be, and then have the second half of the meeting be conversation that would be facilitated by Aussie and the state board member based on the interests of the community and the content there. So we, as part of the overview, we did an overview of the entirety of what's in the plan, and that's because we want to make sure that every community member has a chance to understand the breadth of the work that's documented there, and also to answer questions, because there are parts of the plan that people may not have heard of before, and that might want to have follow-ups in their community about what resources are available or programs are available to the schools, at least from the state level. We've done one draft run-through with a stakeholder group recently, and got some feedback, and it went relatively smoothly and pretty quickly. And so that is the overview of what we anticipate doing, and I think we would be interested still, and we haven't had a chance to touch base with everybody back again about what specific things to prepare for in terms of conversation or facilitation of the conversation piece with each of you, and what ideas or topics we anticipate will be the most interesting to the community, or ways of framing questions that we might want to share or go back and forth about ahead of time. And we'd be happy to, either via email or phone call, set up that time with you guys ahead of time. And some of that's sooner ahead than later at this point, but to prepare with each of you.
I'll just say, in terms of the deck, I think a couple folks may have had questions about the length of the slides, and we understand that shorter would be better and that more conversation is helpful. As Shauna said, when we did the run through with, there's actually the Special Education State Advisory Panel recently, we found that it took a little under an hour with lots of jumping in and asking questions along the way, and actually bringing up some topics that weren't necessarily tied to the state plan, and so it wasn't like an hour straight of talking at folks at all. I think you could get through the slides in, I would guess, 20 minutes or so if it was just straight talking. It's the allowing for conversation along the way and then opening it up fully for discussion afterwards. And as Shauna said, part of why we included as much content as we did was just because we do need to say something about each part of the plan and get consultation on each part of the plan. So we tried to keep it brief, but did want to touch on each area.
We will have translations available, and we can talk about if there's specific ones that we think are more, we need in particular volume for different communities that we're happy to bring of the entire deck and of some of the other supporting flyers too.
Well, members of the outreach committee talked briefly yesterday, just kind of about our individual plans in outreach and recruitment, but also about how we like to work with you. I know the first meeting is next week, so we're really interested in making sure that at that point that most of the members feel at base prepared, right, to conduct the meetings. And so we did talk about, in terms of the slide deck, and I haven't seen it yet, so I apologize, but I definitely hope that you guys can be open to working with me and maybe some members of the committee and Paul to kind of, on some suggestions about tweaking language or length or whatever before the end of the week, and we'll kind of look at that and send our feedback, and if you have some responses, that'd be great.
So Marcus, if I can, just so you know, I think again, as part of, we've tried to really recommit and rededicate our focus at OSSE to the Language Access Act and making documents available in translations, and that requires having them set ahead of time.
Gotcha.
So that was part of our preparing these slides.
Okay.
That said, for ancillary materials, for changing the pacing, the formatting, for anything you want to contribute, we are fully open to that.
Okay.
I just want to be honest about where we are in terms of the slides.
Absolutely.
Hold on a second. I hear you, Hansel, and I, of course, am supportive of the Language Access Act. But from day one, I have said I want to see the deck and I want to weigh in on the deck because past experience was embarrassing for me to co-lead with OSSE before your tenure. So I feel like, yeah, I hear you, but you guys didn't get us the deck until today to even look at it and provide comments. And I did send an email right away for later that day saying I'm totally not okay with a 41 slide deck to the community, and especially if we're trying to make it really accessible for low literacy families. So it's not, if we really want it to be a community meeting and not a talking app, that is not best practice at all. And so maybe, given that you've already, it sounds like you already translated the slides, maybe it's just a cut and not a rewrite, but I'm not okay with that. That doesn't feel like partnership at all. And if I'm branded with you all and presenting that, it's got to be something I'm really comfortable with.
And I think that's important. So what we'll do is our committee will definitely do the work of collecting feedback from members about some of their concerns, if there are any, with the deck and any related materials, and we'll relay that to you and see how we can work together on that.
Yeah, I think cuts, certainly we can be open to. We'd still like to have the full set of materials on hand for those parents who want to dig in further. I would also just say that I think when it comes to timing, while I hear that it's hard to get the slides now, I think part of the timing has been just trying to get the meeting scheduled, which also took a while. So I think there's been sort of constraints on both sides, right? And I just want to say that this is not around not trying to hear your concerns. It's been around how to try and get everything in some time. So yeah, I appreciate that suggestion. We will look out for those comments.
also, ensuring that, kind of, if we can work, in concert over the next few days also, and to really establish, because I know that there'll be some staff from OSSI there and some staff from the board there, to really establishing, if you haven't already completely with John Paul, kind of establishing clear roles of the folks in the room so that we know what our job is, in making the meeting run successfully. I think that's really important.
And I think we'd love to hear from you all. Is that something that you want to determine individually, or or do you want to do it in a standardized way? And so what, we're happy to work with John Paul, of course, but sort of what are you all hoping for to come out of that interaction?
I think that's a good question, because we all have distinctly different wards and distinctly different populations, so I think that we should determine the best way to.
Well, but.
I mean, there's some standardized parts.
Yeah, I mean, on basic,
I was gonna say, these have been branded, and after an email dialogue, we kind of agreed, at least there was no further pushback, that we would do this in partnership, that these would be public hearings where we would engage the community, listen to the community in partnership. So I think there is a clear script that we should all have and to some degree stick to. Now, obviously, we're all independent, and there will be points that we'll bring up that are unique to our wards, and we should make sure that you're briefed. We've alluded to that. What are the questions that are going to come up? But we agreed to do this in partnership.
On that point, yeah, I will just say that one thing Sean was reminding me of is we made a concentrated effort, and I hope this will be apparent when you look at the deck, that it is very different, I think, from previous presentations. You will see that it's significantly less text heavy. It is really an attempt to say things in plain language. We look forward to further comments around these that could be cut down further, but that is one thing. And I think part of why, to Joe's point, like part of why we wanted to provide this deck is, while I think the tone of any opening remarks, the tone of questions, where we spend more time or less time could be fully customized, that we wanted to provide some kind of standardized backbone that felt right to all of you, so that people are getting exposure to some common information throughout this.
And I would just say the meetings that were held before the chancellor search or during the chancellor search, I felt like those were extraordinarily well run in terms of very limited content on a screen, but a standardized set of questions that were being pushed out to get feedback. And there wasn't a lot of Q&A. It was really about, we want to hear your input, and we're here to answer questions if we want to. And to the extent that we can have that to the meetings, at least the one that I went to, I don't know if other people felt the same way, they were super, super well done. So it was all small group discussion with readouts and things like this. So it felt like, and I also, what I want to avoid is this feeling that like we are coming in, and I'm not saying you guys are imposing this, to impose our wisdom or knowledge onto you, and then we're gonna answer your questions and walk out like some kind of business suit meeting. But instead, like, let's hear what your concerns really are, and even using those kinds of opportunities to hear genuine community feedback, if we can get critical mass at the meetings to have these small groups. And that, at least, is my ambition, is for people to really feel like they got a chance to interact with their neighbors, to share common principles, to react to something in a common set of questions, that it wasn't like a Q&A.
And I hear you on that tone and that feel, and why that feeling was so welcoming, and I've heard great things about those chancellor meetings. I think the challenge here is that this is really different, right? We're coming with a plan that is 120 pages, and unfortunately, like, that's the reality that Ed asks us to seek public comment, and we're happy to seek public comment, but not all of this content is accessible, unfortunately, and a bunch of it is things, one of the pieces of feedback we got that I think was perfectly valid was right from the state advisory panel was, help us understand how this is different for me as a parent tomorrow, right? Yeah. And the reality is, much of this content is not. It's just not. That's the reality of it. We have to describe how we're allocating federal grant funds, right? That is going to go to the LEA. Even a principal is not likely to be aware of what that is. But that's the reality of the questions we're being asked to answer in this plan from Ed. And so we're trying to, I'm not saying like that's what we have slides on, right? But that is the balance of our work around excellent educators, for example, right? Like that's going to be, we hope that will be evident to parents over time, that you start to see more consistent quality of educators. But in that given year in elementary school, you have one classroom teacher, right? So all this work we're doing with LEAs, like, I think some parents might want to know that we're doing it. Other parents will only care about the quality of their actual classroom teacher. But the work we're still doing around that matters, and we need to make it accessible. So I think it is, I hear you on trying to capture that tone. We'd love to think about what kinds of questions would prompt that, what kinds of small group discussions could prompt that. But the reality is some of this content we think does, there's an obligation that Ed has that we share all of it, right? And we can put it down what it is.
But I think there's a difference between, and sorry if I'm dominating you guys, there's a difference between saying that forum is the right way to provide lots of technical information, because so few people are going to be interested in it, if any, versus what we're required to do, if I understand it, is ensure that we have public comment period and we have public engagement that is live, face-to-face. It doesn't say that for every time you go to the plan, you have to use that mechanism. So the people who are technocratic, I think they're going to weigh in on the survey and via email anyway, just like they're used to on public comment periods for regulatory shift. But for these community meetings, I think we should really be driving up the 3 questions that are really, to your earlier point, people are going to feel in their day-to-day interaction. So it means, guess what? When you look up information online, you're hopefully going to start to see real parallels between what a charter looks like and what a DCPS school looks like in terms of sharing information. Over time, you might see something different about the quality of your teacher, but like really pulling up the stuff we think like your everyday community member is going to be interested in. That's what I'd like to use that forum for. And then preserve the technical pieces, and I know most of the deck isn't technical, for the people who are going to comment, the ones that are going to go online anyway.
Okay. Is this, again, be the last question.
Oh, no, I just really wanted to back that up, and I think it was a requirement for a lot of that in handouts. But I agree, we should not even begin to imagine that this meeting is the way to solve that requirement. It's not good for people in the meetings. And so if we can do it in sort of a routine way by providing people handouts, let's do it. And get to put 3 handouts up there to sort of say you did it. I mean, I hope they'll go out to visit the groups that actually comment on this, but that's not what these are. So.
I think also, I'm eager to see when you take a look. And I'm sorry it wasn't available earlier. Part of it is framing around, we do have these questions that we want people to answer, but partly being able to answer it is helpful to know the framing in which the question is coming. And so a lot of that is, sharing framing about why we believe these things, why we think this is important. Here's some of the things that are happening around teachers or around how the state works, which is why we can come to you with this question. So again, we'll work with Marcus and the rest of the committee, and hopefully when you take a look, we can think of ways to frame those questions and also share the framing about why this is important and why it's coming from us now.
And we'll, like I said, we'll work to get our feedback, because I know, like I said, the deck is relatively new, so we'll work to get our feedback to you as early as possible. A couple of other things I just wanted to mention. One is probably very important to be prepared with some of the why nots in terms of aspects that weren't included in this plan. So around the survey, around the balance between proficiency and growth, and in relation to climate and culture. I think very good answers on those that people can really understand are going to be very important for meetings like this, because the worst thing that happens in meetings is that folks ask questions and feel like they weren't adequately answered, then the whole meeting's a wash, right? No matter how good the information was presented. So I think that's really important. And I guess a few less important but still important things. I think it's a priority of some of the committee members, and I think of the committee as a whole, to figure out how many current parents are going to be in the room. So we did request that school and child's grade level be included on the sign-in sheets, so that we can kind of see how many current parents are in the room. And am I forgetting anything?
Well, and we also wanted to make sure we got that information, because especially for middle school families, when we start to do high school graduation requirements, we want to move back with them.
And one last question: is there a method that your office is using to collect feedback at these meetings?
Yeah, we have a couple of things that we're currently thinking about in terms of something that would be like a handout that someone could get on their way in, sort of like an exit ticket that a teacher has. But if you guys have other ideas, definitely let us know. And I think that's something that if it makes sense to do slightly differently in different boards, or to add multiple ways we could do that. Obviously, we'll remind people that they can, email the mailbox or go to the survey, but we'd love to have something in person for people to be able to hand as they walk out the door.
And that's a great place place where I think, to your point, like the kinds of questions we put on that feedback form, the format of it, we don't.
Right. Absolutely. So hopefully we can work in concert about that exit ticket, which I think is a good idea, just to figure out what questions need to be on.
And did you guys say you'll bring hard copies of the slides in other languages that are much more in the communities that are?
Yeah, so we will have copies of all of them as part of trying to push for the Eventbrite, which we know not everyone who comes to the meeting is gonna fill out, is we have a specific question asking about language, so that can help us to get a sense, but also if you know in your community, like, really make sure you bring a plethora of this particular language, we will do that. Because the deck is the same, it's not hard for us to make copies and sort of take them on the road show, but we don't wanna make, too many of one and not have enough of the other, so you can, we're definitely should be prepared, but if you know more about your specific community's needs, that's helpful for us to know as well.
And we'll continue to get those daily updates with the numbers from the Eventbrite.
It won't be daily.
Okay.
We've committed to the fact that we will do it twice a week and the day before for a particular event.
For those of us that are next week, can we get them, get them twice a week, and once the day before is almost daily, it would really help us.
You will get them on
Okay.
Wednesday, Friday, and for yours, I think it's Tuesday, because your meeting's on Wednesday, if I'm remembering correctly.
So just twice before between now.
3 times.
Wednesday and Friday.
Today's Wednesday.
No, today was Wednesday, so you got it. You're saying you needed a third time to be like, you know what's going on.
Well, it helps us know what's going on, and actually what I was gonna suggest, and I raised it to John Paul, is also to get names, if we can, when you guys have the names, and then we know whether there were networks of people that needed to be, that we were having.
Yeah.
You can see if there's schools there, whatever.
I absolutely heard that question to your ask on, like, you want more modeling, like, we have so much capacity, so if you want more, like, I can only pull the list of names and do your deck on modeling so fast, to be totally frank with you. So I hear your ask, and we are prioritizing the ways that we think are most impactful, and to the extent we can get you additional information. we'll do
That's right,
that.
I'm just gonna say in the future when we do joint meetings, maybe we can handle that more, because it's important to us, and I think part of collaboration is we have to share priorities.
We would love.
Yeah, that would be great.
Please.
Yeah, we asked about information that you all wanted in your meetings when we sent out an email at the very beginning of the year, and no one responded back with particular content.
Actually, I don't think this is.
Okay, thank you. We need to move on, thank you so much for coming. So, it's almost 7 o'clock, do we want to move on with this agenda, or do we want to postpone it, is there anything?
One of the suggestions that I might have, if we do have additional comments and things to the mission statement and center position, it is under the jurisdiction of the admin committee, so we could ask the admin committee to take a look, report back at some point with revisions or stay the same or et cetera. Sorry, Joe.
Why don't I try and have a conversation offline with Ruth? Ruth seems to have concerns with the censure procedure, and I would like to talk through that with her. And I don't think the full body needs to be engaged in that.
So, yeah, well, what I had said when, no one was paying attention, and, for all I know, I'm the one that recommended condensing it, so I'm sorry if I'm like,
Okay.
was I? Anyway, seeing the uncondensed versus the condensed version, I really like the uncondensed better. I just think, like, when we're trying to put these words together, we miss out, right, on some of the nuance of the 2 bullet points, and I really just don't think it's affecting our work, right? Like, if we have 2 bullet points or 1, is anyone willing?
I think my basic question for, I guess, the senior members and also for John Paul is like, first of all, how important is this mission statement to the functioning of the board? And the second question is, could this time be better spent helping students?
As usual, our student representative has hit the nail on the head.
Right.
Thank you.
So can we just leave it? Does anyone care?
I think that we can potentially put it on the agenda for an next retreat. If we want to revisit it at the retreat, we can, but if we want to use it for other things, to Alex's point, we can use our time for our next retreat.
Yeah, and then like wordsmith it or brainstorm.
Sure.
Whatever that.
Yeah.
I'm down with that. Thank you.
All right, awesome. So, no ombudsman, no chief student advocate, so we can close out with John Paul speaking.
I have nothing further.
Your Honor.
No more.
Do you want to talk at all about the council? Do we have an oversight hearing?
Sure.
We do have some things to talk about.
So I did send out today a copy of our draft performance oversight questions. Were as complete as I could get them before I had to send them out. They are due on Friday, and I've been working for, a while to try to get as much as I possibly could. I've been working for a month to try to get answers, but this is as close as I could get to final before I sent them. They are a reflection of what we've done in FY16 and to date in FY17, including agency-wide functions, budget functions, as well as our policy work. So please take a chance to take a look at them. I'm not wedded to any of the language whatsoever, so please send edits and questions and whatever you need. The Ombudsman and Student Advocate received separate questions this year, and so they are compiling those, and once they're all completed, I'll put them in a document and send them to council where they will be made public, and then we will have our performance oversight hearing on February 15th, which is the same day as our next public meeting. And so I've requested for us to go first. We're paired with the Deputy Mayor for Education. And I encourage you to speak to your constituents about folks if they would like to testify in favor or in support of the state board's work over the past year. That would be very appreciated for us later in budget season. So I have also sent emails to, actually Jamaica sent emails to all members of the council requesting meetings between now and our performance oversight hearing to brief them on what our responses say and what we've been up to for the past year. And as soon as I get, actually tomorrow I'll send you a list of the meetings that we currently have scheduled. I think we have 4, and we'll continue to try to schedule those from now until the 15th. If members of council can't meet before that, we'll certainly meet with them after that as well. The priority, of course, is to meet with the members of the Committee on Education prior to the 15th.
So can Jamaica send calendar invites and all those be easier? The other thing I'd like to point out is that the two offices under our agency are submitting testimony or testifying tomorrow before the council and submitting statements on their performance oversight, and we as the agency have not seen those, and I'm very uncomfortable with that. I'd like to work with the governance committee and John Paul and the rest of the board to make sure that doesn't happen going forward. We should know what they're saying. They're independent. We can't control what they say, but we should know what they're saying. Wanted to throw that.
All right. Any other matters? Then, can I have a motion?
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
That was fun.